Good evening, Tansei, and welcome to APTN National News. I'm Daryl Stranger. A bill passed by the Trudeau government will eliminate mandatory minimum sentences on some crimes. But critics say Bill C-5 does not go far enough and will not reduce the massive overrepresentation of Indigenous women in Canadian prisons. APTN's Fraser Needham has more.
The new legislation repeals mandatory minimum sentences for most drug and some firearms offences, but mandatory minimums remain on the books for murder, sexual offences, and impaired driving. Senator Kim Pate says mandatory minimum sentences as a whole don't achieve their goal and disproportionately target minority groups such as Indigenous women.
The reality is, if mandatory minimum penalties made us safer, then the United States should be the safest place in the world, and if implementing them is soft on crime, then show us the evidence that jailing more and more Indigenous women and putting more and more of their kids in state care is going to make us safer.
Jonathan Rudin of Aboriginal Legal Services agrees mandatory minimums don't make the streets any safer.
There's no evidence that mandatory minimums make communities safer or deter crime, but they do disproportionately have an impact on Indigenous people, and they do lead to even more of the mass incarceration of Indigenous people that we see.
Rudin says these sentences particularly miss the mark in cases of Indigenous women who may be in situations of long-term abuse and responding in self-defense.
First and second degree murder convictions for women who often are responding to violence. Again, do we necessarily need to have a mandatory minimum? Does it have to be, 10, 25 years? No. So there are, and similarly with some of the firearms offenses that are still there, what happens when you're in court on a regular basis is you see all these exceptions.
Kat Owens with Women's Legal Education and Action Fund also says by keeping some mandatory minimum sentences in place, women will continue to plead guilty to crimes they don't want to.
If you're facing criminal charges and there's a mandatory minimum penalty involved, it does change the sort of calculation of risk that you do when deciding whether or not to plead guilty to a particular offense. And it gives prosecutors a lot of power to push for guilty pleas for someone to a lesser offense that might not have a mandatory minimum.
Pate and others in the Senate had tried to amend Bill C-5 so judges could override mandatory minimum sentences in exceptional circumstances. But this amendment was defeated. Fraser Needham, APTN National News, Ottawa.
And joining us now to talk more about Bill C-5 and mandatory minimum sentences is Ontario Senator Kim Pate. Thanks so much for joining us today, Senator Pate. So we understand Bill C-5 eliminates mandatory minimum sentences for some offenses, but not all. So can you tell us which offenses mandatory minimum sentences are still on the books for, and why this may be a problem for Indigenous women specifically?
Thank you very much, Gerald. And yeah, it removes a lot of the drug offenses and some weapons offenses. It tends to be the offenses that result in shorter sentences. And Indigenous women in particular tend to be convicted of what are often referred to as violent crimes, even though the context is usually such that they're responding to violence first perpetrated against them. So assault with a weapon. And if you think of, women in situations where they're being attacked, if they engage in hand-to-hand combat, they're more likely to end up seriously harmed or even dead themselves. And so if they grab something, even if it's a pan or a knife or something, they can be convicted of weapons offense. And so the fact that we know right now Indigenous women are 1 in 2 of federal prison people serving 2 years or more. In Saskatchewan, Manitoba, and the North, 75% and more of women serving less than 2 years, and 95 to 100% of the young women and girls who are in custody. And most of them are there for trying to navigate poverty, homelessness, all of the very issues, violence that they've experienced, all of the very issues that the missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls and inquiry chronicled. And that Justice Buller wrote to our committee, the legal committee at the Senate, and said basically not repealing all mandatory minimum penalties or allowing judges to not impose those that it doesn't repeal means that judges are prevented from exercising Section 718(2)E, which is one of their sentencing principles, often referred to as the Gladue principles. And so it really is making judges not do their job. And the unintended consequence of this is that we are likely to see more and more Indigenous women jailed, more of their kids taken into so-called care or into the child welfare system. And that is a huge human and social and also financial cost that really those resources should be going into the community. So it's why the Honorable Murray Sinclair, it's why the National Chief of the Assembly of First Nations, it's why Indigenous leaders everywhere, Aboriginal Legal Services, on and on, as well as many of the folks of African descent who presented, argued that we should amend Bill C-5 to allow judges the discretion to not impose any of the mandatory minimum penalties that weren't repealed. And Bernadette Clément, one of Senator Clément, a senator of African descent, was the one who moved that amendment in the Senate. I moved it unsuccessfully at the committee. She moved it in the Senate, and more than a third of senators voted for it. But you can see very clear some of the divide when you see that it was, overwhelmingly those of us who have worked on these issues on the ground who supported the amendment, and many more people who were really struck by the government's push to not appear soft on crime, when in fact, as I say, if jailing more Indigenous women, putting more kids in custody actually made us safer, I'd like to see the evidence.
So, Senator Pate, are mandatory minimums making streets safer?
No, in fact, quite the opposite. If in fact they did, then the United States should be the safest place in the world to live, because that's where and in fact, many of the states are pulling back from them. Just last week, the day after our vote on Bill C-5, the District of Columbia voted to eliminate most of, if not all of, their mandatory minimum penalties. Many European jurisdictions have gone that way, and in fact, many countries are recognizing that in fact it's the mandatory minimums. They're presented as though, everybody gets the same sentence, without looking at the underlying inequalities that contribute to certain people being more likely to come to the attention of whether it's policing or state authorities. And we all know this, how many times it's Indigenous and Black people are disproportionately picked up, questioned, criminalized, and incarcerated. And so it's the pretext that the law applies equally. And I often use the example when I'm talking to particularly law students or anybody, but that there was a quote that that I used to use in class, and it was, "The law applies equally to the rich and the poor." It was a quote from 1700s in France, and it was by a philosopher, Anatole France, and it said, the law applies equally to the rich and poor. Neither is permitted to steal bread or sleep under bridges. And I think, to me, that epitomizes the fact that mandatory minimum penalties don't look at the underlying realities of who's more likely to be convicted of these offenses, who's more likely to be struggling in poverty, who's more likely to be picked up and prosecuted, and if they're prosecuted, convicted and imprisoned. And how often is that really a function of people trying to just navigate poverty, trying to navigate increasingly inhospitable communities? And, as we saw with the James Smith Cree Nation, Indigenous leaders, a horrific tragedy, but people didn't call for longer, more punitive sentences. Leaders were calling for resources in the community, housing, clean water, supports for healing centers, addiction programs. That's where we should be putting our money, not keeping these mandatory minimums on the books and allowing more and more people, particularly Indigenous and other racialized people, to be jailed, and most especially Indigenous women.
Well, we'll have to leave it there, Senator Pate, but we want to thank you for taking some time for us today and updating us on what's going on there. So thank you.
Thank you, Daryl, and thank you to all of you for all the work you do every day.
Chiefs from Treaties 6, 7, and 8 gathered in Edmonton recently and denounced the Alberta government's proposed Alberta Sovereignty Act. The act would allow the province to ignore federal laws, including those that govern resource extraction. But the proposed act would first have to survive potential court challenges. APTN's Chris Stewart has more.
24 chiefs representing Treaties 6, 7, and 8 spoke as one. They vigorously condemned new Alberta Premier Danielle Smith's proposed, quote, Alberta Sovereignty within a United Canada Act, unquote. The Act gives Alberta the right to ignore any federal law that it believes harms the province's best interests. That includes laws related to resource extraction and environmental protections. Chief Tony Alexis of the Alexis Nakota Sioux Nation in Treaty 6 says the proposed bill is unconstitutional and illegal.
We will not stand by quietly and allow colonial governing structures and people to ignore our inherent rights as treaty people. This bill sets up the province to allow extraction to happen at any rate completely unprotected. The fight for our rights to land and resources seems to never end.
Chief Darcy Dixon of the Bearspaws First Nation in Treaty 7 says there was no consultation with any Indigenous leader in Alberta.
We should have been the first stop for this discussion as stewards of these lands, as treaties people. Treaty 7 views the Alberta Sovereignty Act as completely unethical.
Treaty 8 First Nations of Alberta Grand Chief Arthur Noski said the treaties were signed by the federal government, not the province.
Smith's proposed bill undermines the authority and the duty of the sovereign nations that entered into treaty. How can the province make a sovereignty bill when our treaties were made before the creation of Alberta?
We are continually ignored and not acknowledged by federal, provincial, and municipal governments in the way we deserve. And now the Premier of Alberta, Danielle Smith, is seeking to provoke the majority of Albertans, First Nations, and other Indigenous peoples to appease a small minority of Albertans who are unhappy with the Liberal government.
When asked about a recent story from APTN that shows no evidence of Premier Danielle Smith's claim of Cherokee ancestry, those gathered here laughed.
I think if I can, I think they should go to the Pink Palace here, the Canada office. They're the ones that have that category of which bloodline you are, and maybe if she can find herself there, maybe that will believe.
In a statement to APTN, the Premier's office says, "We are committed to ensuring the legislation specifically states nothing within the Act is to be construed as abrogating or degrading from any existing Aboriginal and treaty rights of the Aboriginal peoples of Canada that are recognized and affirmed by Section 35 of the Constitution Act 1982. It goes on to say that the Premier and Indigenous Relations Minister will be reaching out to treaty chiefs to book in-person meetings. With the majority government, the bill could be passed before a provincial election is expected next year. APTN reached out to the federal government, and we will follow the story as it develops. Chris Stewart, APTN National News, Edmonton.
More than 1 million bottles of children's pain medication should arrive in Canada this week.
We're hoping to get, this product in so that we can help serve our patients in the community, to get everyone, healthy.
Hospitals will get the first shipments, then pharmacies. Health Canada says the medication may look a bit different since it is coming from a foreign source. It may also need to be administered differently. The products will come with information packets explaining if that is the case. The shipments will hopefully help ease shortages that have plagued the country for months. All right, it's time for a short break, but first, here's a story our reporter Sarah Connors is working on.
Because that's me right there.
Roy Johnson claims he was just 4 years old when he was sent to the Chutla Residential School in Carcross, Yukon. But according to documentation, Johnson wasn't officially enrolled at the school until 2 years later, at the age of 6. He says during that time, he experienced horrific abuses.
Someone told me, forget about it. Can't. A 5-year-old doesn't want to. Because he knew what happened to him.
Now, Johnson wants the federal government to compensate him for the years they've refused to recognize and apologize for the pain and suffering he endured. That's coming soon on APTN National News.
Welcome back. They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery. But when it comes to some consumer products, it's best to make sure you're getting the real thing.
We're seeing a lot of scam sites that are popping up pretending to be Manitoba Mucklucks.
Manitoba Muckluck says as popularity grows, so does the number of people trying to scam its customers. It says ads and websites try and trick customers into handing over money for what they think is the brand's products at a big discount.
Those sites are taking our product images, our name, our logo, creating a website and selling our products at a very deep discount, taking people's money and never delivering any product because they're not associated with us.
The company says it only sells and advertises through its manitoba.ca and .com websites, as well as some wholesalers. It recommends you check the page you're on, as well as its About Us section, and warns you need to be wary of any heavy discounts. Winnipeg Police said the Financial Crimes Unit received one report today. It was a powerful moment. A Cree Soto singer sang the national anthem at yesterday's Grey Cup football game. Tegan Little Chief is from the White Bear First Nation in southern Saskatchewan. She kicked off the final between the Toronto Argonauts and the Winnipeg Blue Bombers with a powerful rendition of O Canada in Cree, French, and English. Little Chief was named the Indigenous Artist of the Year at the 2022 Saskatchewan Country Music Awards. She has sung the national anthem at other games, but this was her first Grey Cup and her first in 3 languages. She's been working on her Cree lately, and blending the 3 languages together for O Canada was a challenge she was willing to take on.
I have a Cree teacher here at White Bear, and we had started working on it, and then a few days later he messaged me and goes, "Can you sing it in English and French?" I said, "Yes, of course I can." I had taken French in school.
The game itself was a nail-biter, with Winnipeg being denied a three-peat as the Toronto Argonauts won by 1 point, 24-23. All right, we have to step aside one final time, but still ahead, a look at some new additions to the Yukon's permanent art collection. Welcome back. It's time now for our photo of the day. Gordon Courtney sent in this photo of the sunset overlooking Lake Simcoe near Orillia, Ontario. It's a great shot, Gordon. Looks like you've received some snow in your region too. We want to see your great photos, so email them to us using share@aptn.ca to send us your photos. All right, now let's take a look at tomorrow's weather forecast. Beginning on the East Coast, 4 degrees in St. John's and 3 in Halifax. -6 in Cartwright and -7 in snow in Happy Valley Goose Bay. -4 in Quebec City and 0 in Montreal. +5 in Toronto and -1 in North Bay. -2 in snow in Timmins and -5 in snow in Big Trout Lake. -17 in Churchill and -8 in Thompson. -4 in Barons River and -3 in Gimli. +2 and clear in Regina and 0 degrees in Saskatoon. -1 in La Ronge and -3 in snow in Stony Rapids. Moving west, +2 in Fort Chipewyan and +5 in Peace River. 4 degrees in Edmonton and 4 degrees in Calgary. 7 in Campbell River and 4 in Bella Coola. 9 degrees in Sands Pit and -1 in Dease Lake. -14 in Beaver Creek and -13 in snow in Rock River. -11 in Norman Wells and +5 in Fort Liard. -7 in Fort McPherson and -6 in Colville Lake. -20 in Cambridge Bay and -16 in Chesterfield. -22 in Igloolik and -17 in Iqaluit. For over 4 decades, the Yukon government has been working to grow the territory's permanent art collection. With hundreds of pieces in the collection, it represents the very best of what the Yukon art scene has to offer, especially when it comes to First Nations art. Here's our reporter Sarah Connors with a look at this year's newest acquisitions.
It's art that has viewers stopping and staring. These pieces are part of Disorientation, an exhibition at Yukon government's main administration building in Whitehorse. The exhibit features 16 new acquisitions to the Yukon Permanent Art Collection. Each year, artists submit their work for selection, like Ta'anquachan Council artist Jared Kane. Kane carved this piece, Raven and Creek Mother, which is a tribute to his late great-grandmother.
So the raven on the bottom represents me. The woman represents my great-grandmother, and the salmon represents her teaching me about the salmon, how important the salmon were to our people.
Kane is one of 5 First Nations artists whose work was selected this year. He says the territory's art collection needs to be reflective of its original people.
Because we're on First Nation land, for one, and it's really important.
Other new First Nations works in the collection include illustrations by Tahltan comic artist Cole Pauls and photography by Northern Shoshone artist Crystal Silverfox. Calvin Moorberg is a Tlingit carver behind this piece, The Eagle's Feast. He's hopeful his work will raise awareness about declining Chinook salmon numbers.
I strongly feel that we, as artists, need to continue to push these issues front and center through our work.
People are excited. They're excited to see new pieces. They're excited to talk to the artists.
Garnet Muthing is the exhibit's curator. She says First Nations art has always been a staple of the collection since its inception in 1981.
It's also a reflection of the artistic and the cultural traditions that are so long-standing here that foster such an amazing arts community.
The new acquisitions join more than 500 other works in the collection by 275 artists. In the coming months, the exhibition will be rotated through public buildings across the territory rather than a conventional gallery.
The reason we do that is so that art becomes part of people's everyday lives here. So we want to put it in spaces where people are just encountering it and enjoying it as part of their everyday happenings.
This year's exhibit will be on display until spring 2023. Kane says he's happy Yukoners from all across the territory will get the chance to see his work.
I'm noticing that a lot of people are stopping in their tracks, and that's exactly what I want. I want them to stop and see our pieces, right?
Sarah Connors, APTN National News, Whitehorse.
Certainly some beautiful artwork there. All right, that's all we have for you tonight on APTN National News. If you missed any of our news and want to catch up, you can head to our website, aptnnews.ca. I'm Daryl Stranger. Thank you for joining us. Miigwech, and have a great night.